Good afternoon, everyone. An absolute delight to be here. It's a privilege to be a speaker at a series that is fast emerging as the most prominent platform for conversations around international affairs in a city that I grew up in. And I'm very slightly emotional moment as well for me, because this is the first instance that I'm actually conversing with the citizenry body of the city. So thank you to the Yashwantrao Chavan Center for the opportunity. In particular, I want to thank my colleagues, Prof. Mrudul, Deepthi, Purva, Yogesh over there, and all of you for making it to this little talk. I'm an academic, I'm a social scientist, and I'm not quite used to too much formalism in the way in which I interact with my audience, because the primary audience that I interact with are usually students. This is a much wider and a general audience. You're all citizens of this country and the city. So I'm going to try and see if there's a way in which I'll put my ideas in as simple a term as possible. In case there is a word that you come across, a concept that you come across that you don't quite follow, just please raise your hands and I'd be happy to flesh it out for you. I want to speak on liberal democracy, and there are four parts to this talk that I want to flag up front. It's already there, right? So I'm going to first very briefly talk about the problem that all of us confront, and a problem that is also an intellectual challenge for both the social scientist as well as for the citizen. So that's the first part. The second part of my talk is going to be about this key notion of liberal democracy, about which most of us seem to have an unclear, kind of vague idea. And I think it'll be good to get a sense of what this beast that we are talking about here really is. The third part of the talk, and this is really going to be the meat and substance of the talk, will be a set of arguments that I will make around liberal democracy in contemporary international politics, but also liberal democracy in the context of India, this country. And then I will wrap up with a few thoughts, basis a few remarks that I have made. I'm very glad to see some very distinguished thinkers amidst us, and I'm looking forward to their critical intervention as well. Sir, I'm directed towards you. Okay. So here's the problem that I want to present to all of you. What we are looking at around the world, as well as in this country, is an erasure of liberal democracy. And I use the word erasure after some careful thinking. What I mean by that is, imagine somebody's got an eraser on them, and then they are rubbing out this idea of liberal democracy from the fabric of modern politics, from the fabric of contemporary politics. This is happening in the context of India, but this is a worldwide phenomenon. This is happening in what is called the heartland of liberal democracies, which is the West. It's happening in other places as well, right? It's also happening in places where you don't have democratic systems, but where are people who are interested in liberal democracy, who identify themselves as liberal democrats, right? So there's a way in which we are witnessing around the world something that I describe as the erasure of liberal democracy. And there is, some people are impatient with it because it does not deliver. Some people are disenchanted with it because it did not deliver on the promises that it made. And others are plain disgusted with it. And I'll give you a name as to, a name that actually suggests, a name with whom you would associate this concept of disgust when it comes to liberal democracy. There are a few forms that this erasure is taking. There is a line of thought which argues that liberal democracy has led to a challenge to, an undermining of, and a violation of the concept of national sovereignty. There were two major developments in international politics that took place in the last decade. One was Brexit. The other one was Trumpism, which is much more than the election to office of Donald Trump. Trumpism is an entire phenomenon. And both of them, at their heart, fundamentally contain this idea that liberal democracy leads to the loss of national sovereignty. I'll unpack it for you later, but just bear with me for now with this. The second reason for people's disenchantment with liberal democracy, second criticism that is leveled in the direction of liberal democracy, is that it assaults the national identity of society, right? So there is an entire argument that is being made that liberal democracy is actually undermining the whiteness or the Christianness of the West. Not very many people a few years ago used to say this explicitly, but increasingly that's beginning to be the case as well. So liberal democracy leads to an assault on identity, indigenous identity of people. Then of course, and this is coming largely from the non-Western world, liberal democracy is associated with Western hubris, height of arrogance, right? And it is also associated with Western domination. And so the argument is that if around the world, especially outside the West, if societies are uncomfortable with liberal democracy, it is because they are pushing back against this idea that liberal democracy is the best way in which a society and a political system can be organized. In the specialist literature, this idea is called the end of history. I'd be happy to talk more about it if you're interested, but this is a pushback against the end of history thesis, and therefore a pushback against Western dominance. A lot of people believe in this country and around the world, especially in the non-Western world, that somehow liberal democracy represents the persistence of Western coloniality after the end of formal colonialism, right? And that's an argument that has been made very interestingly by some very shrewd and clever people and well, interesting people in this country as well. Won't name them, but you know, there's that. Okay, for a lot of the critics, if you look at the critics of liberal democracy, very often they are critics of liberalism, right? These critics hurl different charges against liberalism. I'll come to what liberalism is in a bit, but different charges against liberalism. Vladimir Putin, if you listen to his speeches, and I'm hoping that some of you have had the occasion over the past year and a half, ever since he actually became rather active in international politics, he's been railing against liberalism for quite some time, associating it with a whole range of decadent tendencies that you can see in the West. He associates liberalism with homosexuals, with degenerate tendencies of one kind or the other. So liberalism represents the decadence of the West. That's one way of thinking about it. The other one is that liberalism is actually destructive, and it is destructive because it is degenerated into something called wokeism. Is there anyone here who is not sure of what the word wokeism is? W-O-K-I-S-M. Wokeism. Anyone who knows what wokeism is? Woke politics, right? Okay, right? Woke politics is the kind of politics in which you have progressive opinions, but you do not know how to compromise with the opponent in the pursuit of your progressive goals, right? So you hold opinions that are excessively progressive, but you can't cut deals on the ground with your political opponents, and that is the kind of irresponsible progressive politics to which you give the name woke, right? Woke politics. So it's degenerated into wokeism. And this is the third one, is a classical charge that is leveled against liberalism, and it is that liberalism produces deracinated, ahistorical, and self-interested individualism. Deracinated, people who are shorn of culture, people who do not take pride in their own culture, people who don't quite understand their culture. These are people who are not rooted, they're not sons and daughters and children of the soil. Liberals are basically these transnational elites who are more interested in what's happening to Rihanna than what might have been said by somebody, 75 years ago in their own specific community. So they're deracinated in one way. They're ahistorical. They don't quite understand their own history. And because they don't quite understand their own history, they can't take pride in their own history. So they're ahistorical in that sense. These are people who don't understand their culture, who don't understand their history, and they are self-interested. They're only interested in oneself, and therefore this is a particularly debilitating, undesirable form of individualism. Right? So that's another kind of critique that is leveled against liberalism. And then, of course, it's straightforward elitism, right? I mean, it's the elite. There's this argument that liberalism is not something that everyone can afford. I'm not very sure about it, and I hope to persuade you to that point of view. And of course, there is another criticism that is leveled against liberalism, and that is that it is another name for Westoxification, a whole range of ideas from the West that have intoxicated the rest of the world, so therefore Westoxication, right? And liberalism is another name for, there's an insidious way, subversive way in which liberalism has permeated into the lives of all the non-Western people, the brown people, the black people, the not so brown, the not so black people, the yellow people, the red people, and it's made them all Westoxificated, right? And therefore we don't like it. Anyway, so here are some clippings from news reports that provide an illustrative flavor of the crisis that I'm talking about. 2016, BBC asks if now that Trump has won, does it mark the end of liberal democracy? Lo and behold, Joe Biden got elected. And yet somebody ended up saying, hey, Biden may have been elected, but there is a decisive pushback against democratization in the world, and therefore the terminal decline of liberal democracy cannot be avoided. It's not something that you can stop. There have been things said about India as well. The backward slide of Indian democracy, some people have described it as electoral autocracy. And while there are others who feel that India's best bet in terms of gaining respect and reputation in international affairs is in fact to reassert its liberal democratic credentials. All right, so this is where we are, therefore. The future of liberal democracy is uncertain, and its survival is at stake. And that's why the title of my talk is Should Liberal Democracy Have a Future? I'm a social scientist by training, and a few years ago, if I was pondering the idea of liberal democracy, if I was doing it a few years ago, I would have rather asked a different question. Does liberal democracy have a future? So that's the objective question that you ask, right? You look at a few indicators, you sort of look at how many countries in the world are democratic, how many political parties in the world are actually, profess liberalism, and how many economies in the world are capitalist. And you put all of those things together and you'll be able to sort of say, well, whether it does have some kind of future, that future is robust and so on and so forth. I think we've passed that stage. And the question of the future of liberal democracy is no longer the question of the social scientist alone. It is a question of the citizen. And this citizen can be a pregnant citizen. It could come in, multiple forms. So what you see in that column over there is just the different form that the citizenry takes. It is the citizen's question. The future of liberal democracy is a question of the citizens who are invested in the idea of liberal democracy. And therefore we need to ask ourselves whether we should give liberal democracy a chance, right? Now, my argument is that liberal democracy has its flaws, but it is still our best bet. It is still our best bet against enduring lasting sources of unfreedom, forces in the world that curtail our freedom, forces in the world that make us unfree. Liberal democracy is our best bet against these forces. And that's the argument that I'm going to make and then defend today. But in order to understand why we should defend and secure liberal democracy, we need to first understand liberal democracy as an idea itself, and that's what I'm going to move next to. Chair, please let me know if I'm doing good in terms of time. Okay, because I have a tendency to ponder longer than I intend to. So this is liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is the coming together of two historical forces, liberalism and democracy. And there's a very simple way in which both these notions, both these historical forces can be understood. Let's look at the democracy first. Thankfully, that's not the middle finger, right? So let's look at the democracy first. One way of thinking about democracy is to say that this is rule of the ordinary and not of the extraordinary. This is a definition that comes very elegant, very illustrative. I thought it comes from the political theorist and philosopher John Donne. It's the rule of the ordinary rather than the extraordinary. And at the heart of democracy is election. If you have a country, a political system in which there is election, it is a democracy. Cambodia had elections 2 days ago. You could say, the conclusion was foregone. Everyone knew who was going to win and so on and so forth. It's still a democracy. People are participating, elections taking place, because at the heart of democracy is election, and fundamentally a democracy is about the process of establishing government. So that's one part, right? But this democracy has come to be coupled since the late 18th century, and the two markers, if you're looking for, are the American and the French revolutions. That's how they come together. That's how they begin to come together. Since the late 18th century, democracy has come to be associated, come to weave itself around this idea of liberalism. Again, there's so many different ways in which people talk about liberalism, but at the heart of liberalism is the idea of a constitutional regulation of state power. And the powers of the state are always expressed through government, and therefore, if you are talking about liberalism, you are necessarily talking about the constitutional regulation of the powers of the government. So if democracy is about the process of establishing government, liberalism is about the goals of the government. Right? In the first picture, you see people voting. In the second picture, the elected representatives are struggling with each other to figure out what to do with the mandate that has been given to them. Right? So the goals are what is in focus in the second one. And some of the key concepts of liberalism are separation of powers, human rights, rule of law, equality before law. These two forces, world historical forces, have come together since the late 18th century to give us liberal democracy. The journey of liberal democracy in modern history has not been a linear one. Countries have gone back and forth in their progress towards liberal democracy. And you've had the political scientist Samuel Huntington had an entire theory of democratization. It sort of say that in the modern times you've had waves of democratization. So there's a wave that made a whole range of countries democracies, and then the wave receded and a number of countries slided back to being non-democratic and so on and so forth. So the progress of liberal democracy has not been linear, it's been checkered, but it has always taken, but when you think about liberal democracy, you must think therefore about these two ideas, and they have come together only in the modern times, and therefore you can have illiberal, non-liberal peoples and all kinds of other democracies in the world, right? Okay. Critics of liberal democracy, I've already said, are often critics of liberalism. And if you want to understand what I mean by that is, in the 2000s, when Dr. Manmohan Singh was India's Prime Minister, both within the country and abroad, he would describe India as a liberal democracy, and he's done that on multiple occasions, right? When was the last time you heard anyone within the establishment, the formal as well as the informal establishment, describe India as a liberal democracy? Hasn't happened. The democratic credentials of this country continue to be very emphatically asserted. But liberalism has gone missing because people have problems with liberalism, even though they continue to pay lip service to democracy. And one of the arguments I'm going to make today is that if you take liberalism out of democracy, you're left with nothing else, very little else. The classical worry over the decoupling of liberalism and democracy is that if you take liberalism out of democracy, democracy begins to descend into tyranny, which is to say that what you begin to stare at, what you begin to risk is arbitrary use of power. What I'm going to argue is that if we start giving up on liberal democracy, we stand to lose 200 years of gains that our founders, not just the founders of the Republic in 1947, but the founders of modern India, fought hard to secure. Right? And that's the argument that I'm going to make today. This is a series that is about foreign policy and international politics, and I promise you, by the time I conclude, you will see the way in which this connects to international politics. For India and Indians, it means risking 2 centuries of hard-fought gains that have made us modern, democratic, inclusive, and a united society and polity. If we give up on liberal democracy, that's the future that we are looking at. The future is not about some glorious past to which we'll be able to give some kind of a revival. It's a bleak future that we stare at, and I say this after careful thought. Because we are a very large part of humanity, the crisis of liberal democracy in India is also a global crisis, and that's one of the ways in which we should think about liberal democracy in India. Okay, I want to draw your attention to the package of modern liberalism. There are 4 faces to modern liberalism: international, philosophical, social, and political. International liberalism takes the form of an international order. An order is any arrangement that produces some kind of regularity, right? I mean, that's the basic understanding of order. Now, international liberalism thinks or envisages an international order that comprises capitalism, international institutions, international law and norms, and human rights. Those are the key elements of international liberalism. And this entire package of institutions, laws, norms, human rights, and capitalism, this package is protected by the military power of liberal democracies. And this power does 2 things. One, it polices the global commons, so your seas, etc., are kept free by the power of liberal democracies, but it also reserves the right to interfere in the affairs that are illiberal in character in international politics. And that's one thing that has produced a lot of resentment in the world, right? Why are you interfering in our affairs? From the point of view of liberal democracies, if we don't interfere, then you're not just going to jack up your life, but also the lives of everyone else in the world. So therefore, we have that right, and it's a very contentious thing. Happy to talk about it if you're interested. International liberalism in modern times has taken the form of something that used to be called the liberal international order. Those of you who are in academia might be familiar with this term, but if you're not, then it's okay. The greatest challenge today to the liberal international order, the greatest challenge today to international liberalism comes from China and Russia. I call them the revisionist geopolitical actors, that are entirely unhappy with this entire package, right? Particularly human rights, particularly international institutions that don't work for them. So there is that. And slightly aware of the fact that this is what is going on, some of the champions of the erstwhile liberal international order have now started talking about another concept, rules-based international order. Those of you who are familiar with Indian foreign policy must be coming across this term in the last couple of years quite often, rules-based international order. We tend to think of it in terms of the Indo-Pacific, but it is a larger construct. Okay, so that's one phase of liberalism. Political liberalism, it's the same as liberal democracy. We've gone through this, so I won't repeat myself. That's the second phase. Third phase of of modern liberalism is its philosophical phase. And this is a very, very important phase. And I just want 15 seconds of your attention right now, because if you get this, you get what philosophical liberalism is. At the heart of philosophical liberalism is the idea that the individual human person, the individual human person is the irreducible unit in human affairs. Yeah, you can break a collective of any kind, you will not destroy humanity. But this individual corporeal person, myself, you can't. If you destroy this, you destroy humanity, right? So the irreducible unit in human affairs is the individual human person. And again, that human person can take any form. It can take any form, but that's the unit. And that's the basic idea of philosophical liberalism. The task of any political system is to create conditions for the realization of the individual's potential that is indefinite. You just don't know what an individual who's given free play can potentially achieve. Right? And that's the insight. That is the insight. We just don't know what, if you give optimal conditions to an individual, what they're going to, maybe they'll just, while their life away, and that's a risk worth taking. But what if one of them actually ends up doing something that is just supremely mind-blowing? That's a possibility, right? And that's a good enough possibility to invest in the creation of a political system that maximizes that potential. Hence liberal democracy. And traditionally, there are three forces that have been considered as the greatest impediments to the realization of that potential: the state, society, and religion or tradition, which is why you would see liberals are always very skeptical of each one of them, and there's a bit of an adversarial position with regard to the state, the society, tradition, religion. Not because the liberals are fundamentally pathologically incapable of appreciating the good that the state, the society, or religion or tradition does. No, that's not the case. It is because liberals believe that fundamentally each one of them can do something to any one of us that can rob the entirety of humanity of a potential breakthrough. You see what I'm trying to say here? Hence philosophical liberalism. Each individual human person is the irreducible unit in human affairs. And finally, and this is what I'm going to talk about, social liberalism. Right? Here I innovate upon the concept of liberal modernity that the political scientist G. John Eikenberry has offered. Professor Eikenberry says that liberal modernity is the engine of global historical change. I've got the PhD, so I have the license to do some kind of an innovation here. So I'm calling it social liberalism because that description serves my purpose a little better. But Professor Eikenberry says that liberal modernity is driven by science, discovery, innovation, technology, learning, constitutionalism, and institutional adaptation. With the help of examples from modern India, I'm going to set out 5 ways in which social liberalism has expressed itself and gone on to build the foundations of modern India. And my argument would be this package of philosophical, international, political, and social It's a mutually reinforcing package. And if any one of them weakens, the entire liberal ecology weakens. So you may be unhappy with liberal democracy, but your unhappiness with liberal democracy may contain within it the seeds of the destruction of you and I as modern beings. I'm being slightly alarmist in my language here, but I want to substantiate this in the slides ahead. If we don't care about liberal democracy, we stand to see the erosion of the gains that have enriched our lives in various ways, that have made us who we are in large parts today. And what is it that we are talking about? The Indian version of social liberalism. Mind you that this experience of different societies have, all societies in the modern world have experienced social liberalism. Just talking about the Indian case here. The Indian version of social liberalism has basically had 7 key elements. And if we take note of these 7 elements, one of the things that we can automatically get rid of, a notion that we can disabuse ourselves of, is that liberalism is a Western imposition upon us. It is not, my dear friends, it's not. Liberalism is as much an Indian idea as it is a Western one. In fact, liberalism is a globally produced idea, a globally circulating idea to which modern Indians have made important contributions. What are those ways in which we have made these contributions, and what is the form that social liberalism has taken in this country? Just 7 key ideas. First one might be a little difficult, and if you're a liberal, then the conservative would actually say, well, my point is proven. But I want to take you, imagine yourself being in the early 19th century. Yeah? It was around then that the first modern Indians decided to make India a part of the modern world. And this world was a new world that the West was forging. This was a decision taken by modern Indians. It was an active decision, and they decided that they're going to do it on their terms, on our terms. And the 3 examples of this that I want to draw your attention to. This is old stuff. We don't even talk about this anymore. But lifting the taboo on crossing the waters and traveling to the West, it's not a thing that people talk about today. But there used to be a point when you did not leave your shores because you could be polluted. Right? The foreign shores were uncongenial to you. Savarkar called it Sindhubandi. Right? It's not congenial to your culture, it's not congenial to your caste, and so on and so forth. And said, well, we need to break this because we need to go out and see what is going on in the world. We have to travel to the West. Big idea. Doesn't seem like it today, but it was back then in the early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century. People first started doing this. Adopting the English language. Huge idea. A huge breakthrough. English was not simply a medium of communication. It was a way in which you made yourself comfortable at home in the modern world. And it did 3 things. 1, it made multilingual Indians intelligible to each other. We started understanding each other in a language through which we could be linked up. It was the language through which we interacted with the British, and it was a language through which we interacted with the rest of the world. So 3-way linkages were drawn. So imagine a slightly complex crisscrossing set of linkages, right? That's what English produced. So we are going out, we've given to ourselves this language, but that's not all. To become modern, to become part of the international community, is not just to occupy a chair, a seat over there, but also start taking interest in the affairs of others. Right? So today we've got people in this country who sort of say, well, look at human rights abuses in the United States. Great. You know who started it? Rajaram Mohan Roy started saying, well, you know what? They are interested in our affairs, great, but we are also interested in what is going on in Europe. Why is there this gap between what the Europeans preach and what they practice. Right? You are not just taking interest in the affairs of the West, but you're also making your views known. Right? And that's what a member of the international community does. And this is how you began to become part of the modern world. It was a conscious decision. And this decision was the first expression of social liberalism. Second, restructuring the social order. At the heart of this idea was the judgment that the Indian social order was not a divine creation that could not be changed. It was made by humans and it could be changed, it can be changed, it should be changed. Again, it doesn't seem like a novel thing to us, but again, go back to the first people who actually started pondering this idea that this thing that is given to us, called caste, which organizes our society hierarchically and which fixes people in certain slots for all times to come. There is nothing sacrosanct about it, and even if it is, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to make it profane. Right? And we're going to restructure the Indian social order. And we're going to go after the principle that lends to this social order its hierarchical character, caste. Got 3 names from Maharashtra. I can give many more. I've just mentioned 3 here, but there are many others. And what were their influences? Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man, anti-slavery movements, Western liberal and republican ideas. Did they just borrow them and sort of say, well, this is the direction in which we're going? No. They said, well, there's something interesting going on in these countries in the West. Let's see what are the similar situations and what are the similar, do we have similar circumstances over here? And yes, we do. Then let's see what they've done. Oh, they've done this. Okay, so we can do something similar over here. And this is what they end up doing. Here's an example. This is Phule's dedication in Gulamgiri. 1873, he is dedicating this book, Gulamgiri, to the good people of the United States. For what? For the work that they have done in the cause of removing slavery. This is 1873. I don't know if that is not liberalism, I don't know what it is. But anyway, third example. And notice the way in which I am formulating this. Expanding the remit of Indian humanity. Who is a human being? Who is this entity that has the same status, enjoys equality and dignity as the rest of us? Not Dalits, not Adivasis, not women, did not. Inferior human beings. They were not fully part of the Indian humanity. It was a conscious effort, decision, struggle made to make them part of the Indian humanity, expanding the remit of Indian humanity. And this is an expression of social liberalism as well. This struggle, by the way, continues today in the realm of LGBTQ rights. I've got some issues with LGBTQ rights and the way in which it is articulated, but that's a separate story. Insofar as the struggle goes, this is a struggle fundamentally about expanding the remit of Indian humanity. Whom do you treat as fully human beings? To whom do you give the dignity, the rights, and the respect that you give to others whom you consider human? Fourth one, rationalist reform of tradition and religion. Rationalist is the key term here. Again, pre-modern settings, nowhere do you see this very idea that you can somehow reform tradition and religion in a certain way. I mean, anything that is providential and divinely ordained, how do you reform it? But here you have the Brahmo, the Arya, the Satyashodhak, and I'm just given these 3, but these are not the only 3 others. Right? I've given you some names over there as well. They're all people who think that rationalism, this thing, this ability that we have, human beings basically work with 3, nature or God if you're interested, has given us 3 basic faculties. All of us can think, all of us can feel, and all of us can imagine. And there are people who grasp this idea that we can think and think our way through the problems of tradition and religion and just basically reform them. Right? Doesn't seem like a very new thing to us today, but in the 19th century it was. Fifth, secularity, which is an attitude, not secularism, which is a policy. And what is secularity? Here, this very simple realization that if you think of this subcontinent as any kind of a political unity, it is multi-confessional in character, it is multi-religious in character. And because it is multi-confessional, because it is multi-religious in character, you need to leave religion aside in order to do any kind of political business. All political transactions have to be at least temporarily suspended from your understanding of religion. These two things have to be separated. Why? Because the people who are ruling over you, Christian, your compatriots, Muslim, Sikh, you look at it from the point of the Muslim, your compatriots, Hindu, Sikh, and so on, whatever way you want to put it, right? Secularity as opposed to secularism. Secularity came to us much before secularism came. Partition did not change this essential character of this country. So if you get rid of secularity, you can have all the problems in the world with secularism, but if you get rid of secularity as our collective temperament, you're dealing with a problem at your hand, right? 6, associational and federative approach to building a national community. It's a bit of a mouthful, but there is a reason I just couldn't do anything about it. But think of the Indian nation. When you think about the nation in terms of a collection of people, think of it as having, as containing two, as being a result of two distinct levels. The first, the social level, was put together through what I call an associational model, right? So all the samitis and sabhas and samaj and association and societies, right? These were established, the Brahmo Samaj, the Arya Samaj, the Satyashodhak Samaj, and this society and that society and all the rest of it. These were primarily functional in the 19th century. They were they laid the first layer of the Indian nation. It was associational in character. You and I are different from each other. Let's associate. Let's not merge, ma'am. Let's not integrate. Let us not lose our identity. Let us associate, bringing the very best sides of us, right? And that associational model is the first, it is the social layer of the Indian nation. And then on top of it is mounted in the 20th century a federative vision. This is the political layer, right? And what is at the heart of any federal idea? Sharing of power, right? So that's how the modern Indian nation has been built. It is associational at the social level and federative at the political level. And every single time you have any pushback, any centralization of power, you will see the federating impulses of Indian polity kicking in. If you look at the recent electoral performances in the last 2-3 years at the state elections, you'll see roughly what I'm talking about. But this is not something peculiar to India. Bangladesh and Pakistan at different moments have also shown very similar tendencies, because that's how the deep foundations of the subcontinent were laid. That's how they were laid. It's associational, it's federative, and on top of it you can do all kinds of exercises today. All kind of monkey business can happen, but those deeper impulses, they come to the rescue of people who are inherently wary of centralization of power, right? 7th and the last one, a constitutional rather than a revolutionary approach to independence. And my young friends, students, a lot of people become very uncomfortable when I talk about gradualism in politics. But there was a reason why they decided to take a constitutional approach to independence. It was because India was and continues to be an unevenly developed country, right? Economic levels, the profile of economic development of the subcontinent generally is uneven. So think about that, unevenly developed. Second, multiple temporalities. Big word. Here's how I'm going to break this out for you. Temporality is a condition of the time in which you live. And the India, to say that there were multiple temporalities is to say that within the subcontinent, on the subcontinent, ma'am, there were some people who were living in the 19th century, some in the 15th, some in the 12th, and some in the 7th, and some wherever, right? So therefore you have multiple temporalities. If you have economic unevenness, you have multiple temporalities, and because of those two things you have ideological pluralism as well. People are not going to have the same opinion because their class position crisscrosses. They live in different temporalities. They're obviously not going to have the same ideology. If this is the mix that you're working with, what else can you do except to give up on revolution? It's not going to work. And as an aside, I want to draw your attention to multiple temporalities. The hard job before any political force, when it is confronting multiple temporalities, is to bring all of them to the contemporary period, right? So bring somebody who's in the 5th century, somebody who's in the 12th, and somebody who's in the 18th, and somebody in the 19th to the 21st. That's a hard job. What's the easier job? Create some kind of an idea of a 3rd century glorious past and push everyone to that. The easier thing to do, right? And this is a problem that exists in all societies where multiple temporalities exist. It's the hard thing to bring everyone to the contemporary period. It's very easy to push collective consciousness to some ahistorical past. And this did the legwork on establishing parliamentary democracy. Now, these 7 ideas, they form the social foundations on which modern and independent India was built. They were all based on post-Enlightenment ideas, which Indians A, appropriated, B, adjusted, C, innovated, and made their own. Social liberalism became the basis of the constitutional order that was established in 1947. And you and I can have all kinds of problems with the functioning of the constitutional order. You and I can have all kinds of problems with the functioning of the democratic order since 1947. But what I want to begin to end my presentation with is this idea that whatever we do, we should not lose sight of the contribution of social liberalism to the emergence of modern India, to the building of modern India. I hope it's clear now that liberalism is not a Western imposition. It is deeply and originally Indian. It is rooted in the societal makeup, culture, and history of modern India. It prepared the social bedrock on which our democratic politics has been mounted. I want to draw your attention to that imagery, the social bedrock on which your democratic politics is mounted. And we need to go back to this part of our modern history, recognize its importance, and reaffirm our commitment to the basics that the founders of modern India put in place. Those 7 ideas. Others as well, happy to talk about it separately, but at least these 7 seem to me the most important ones. Now, what are we facing by means of an alternative? First, the erasure of liberal democracy. 10 years ago, 12, 13 years ago, the Prime Minister of India used to describe India as a liberal democracy. We don't describe India as a liberal democracy anymore. What are the new identities that are given for India? A mother of democracy, a dharmocracy, and a civilizational state. There are reasons for why you would understand that these terms have some valence, they have some importance, and so on. But really, if you ask yourself very seriously, they are either empty terms, or they're clever wordplay, or they end up doing, it is the case with the civilizational state argument, to say that India is not a liberal democracy but a civilizational state. The argument there is that civilization gets associated with a monotone reading of India's early Indian culture, as if Indian civilization is not a product of what we did through the 19th and 20th centuries. The very notion of an Indian civilization is a late 19th, early 19th and 20th century idea. I'll start wrapping it up, Chair, now. These formulations lead to the erasure of the struggle to forge a modern India. And there are a few signs that I want to close this presentation with. Notice what's happening around us. The balance between rights and duties in our political discourse, in our social life, is being tilted in the favor of duties. Kartavya is increasingly we are being told, is more important than adhikar. It's a fine balance, right, between rights and duties. Increasingly, we've been told that duties are more important than rights. Pay attention to it. Second, resistance to progress of fundamental rights in the realms of gender and sexuality. What is the defense given? Very often, that society is not ready for it. I mean, this is the argument we've made for a very, very long time. And of course, you have to always take the sensibilities of the society in question. Of course, you have to. But you have to continue to push against the elements of society that are outdated, right? But there is a resistance that is going on there. And also erosion of the existing corpus of rights. Suspension of access to the due process to dissenters and critics. The next one is very, very important. And I find it, as a social scientist, I find it very, very interesting. Sacralization of political authority. Another big word after temporality is what I mean by that is essentially thinking of political authority as if it was given to us by providence or by divinity, right? And you notice something increasingly in India's political discourse, terms like pap and punya are used. Why should they be used in political discourse? Why should we not think in terms of what is constitutionally fair and unfair? What is constitutionally desirable and undesirable? What is right and wrong from the point of view of constitutional morality? Why do we think in terms of pap and punya when it comes to India's political discourse, right? So that's something that there's a creep, that there's a way in which a certain tendency is creeping up. Reassertion of caste as the organizing principle of society. I don't know if you see it in Western India, but I see it in North India in my travels very extensively, right? There's a very clear reassertion of caste as the organizing principle of the Indian social order. Increasing assertion of the idea that democracy equals majority will and dominance. Majority will and majority dominance. Not using the word majoritarianism because it has become polemical. So people say, "Oh, you're another liberal who's crying majoritarianism." No, but the analytically sound part there is that there is a very serious argument being made that democracy is majority will and majority dominance. Expression dance of democracy has become quite fashionable of late. And the final one is a pushback against science and rationality, and it takes various forms. Notice, for example, the relativization of the theory of evolution. The people who are making the argument somehow there are other theories about the origins of life that can compete, have the same scientific credibility as the theory of evolution. One. Second, the peddling of pseudoscience, right? Different ways in which you sort of attribute all kinds of scientific properties to things that are fundamentally not scientific. Third, violence against rationalists. Don't want to take names here, but you know what I'm talking about. And this violence does not necessarily mean denial of somebody's life. There are other ways in which this gets done. But if you're a rationalist, you have to think twice sometimes before you make your opinion heard today. Disappearance of the emphasis on developing the scientific temper and a critical attitude. That emphasis has gone missing. We don't talk about the scientific temper. We don't talk about a critical attitude. Right? And finally, encouragement to the development of pride. You have to take pride in this, you have to take pride in that, you have to take pride in... There's something very subtly... science and technology are two different things. First, the conflation of science with technology. You sort of say that technological achievements are somehow scientific achievements. They're two different things. Analytically, they're two different things. Technological achievements are very significant, very important, and of course, some amount of pride is required. But if one of the goals of public policy is the cultivation of pride, then you recall these three things that nature has gifted us: the ability to feel, the ability to think, and the ability to imagine. If the ability to feel becomes overblown, then your ability to think suffers, and your imagination starts knocking on the doors of delusion, right? None of this is good news. And these tendencies that I have pointed out today, these are way beyond the question of political liberalism, right? These are actually beginning to knock on the doors with an ominous sign of social modernity, which is the foundation on which modern India was built. So it's for this reason that I would argue that we should pay attention to, we should care about liberal democracy, because if we don't, then it's not that we're going to become an Indian version of the best democracy that human beings are capable of possible, but we might actually stare at something that is deeply unsettling and problematic. I thank you for your patience, and I'd be happy to take questions. Those of you who are interested, these are two books that I would recommend for you to read and learn more from. The second one actually was written in 1938, and a lot of what I've said today, I've relied on the late Magan Lal Buch's book for. Thank you.